Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to welcome Mickey Levine to our third episode of Aliyah Money Talks. We're going to talk about buying a home in Israel, which is a very, very popular topic for Olim, a topic on a lot of people's minds with everything going on with the real estate markets and interest rates. And I'm really, really thrilled to have Mickey on today. Mickey, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and what your practice is here in Israel?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. I'm grateful for the opportunity. My practice, I was born in New York. I lived about 20 years in America, but I've been in Israel for the last 17 years or so, and I'm an attorney and I practice mostly real estate. So that's the bread and butter of what I do. Real estate law in Israel, transactions, taxes, everything that's involved.
Awesome. I know, me and Mickey had a chance to work on a fairly complex project a couple of years back. I know I learned a lot, so I'm really excited for the audience to learn a bit here too. Um, let's jump right into it. If I'm looking to buy a home, what is the what differences should I look for when I'm deciding between buying on paper versus buying secondhand? If I'm looking at buying directly from the kablan, directly from the contractor, or I'm buying a home from somebody who's living there now, somebody who owns the home and selling in the secondary market. What are kind of the differences I should be aware of? Some of them.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot of differences. I mean, first of all, buying on paper is very popular in Israel. It's a really, it's a scary thing to people. You're buying something sight not sight unseen. The site doesn't exist yet, and you're buying something that's totally air right now. It's a scary thing. It's unnerving, but it's very popular, and a lot of people do it, and they're very very happy. The big differences are when you buy secondhand or a pre-owned home from somebody who's living in it, and it's something you can see, you can feel, and there's as opposed to when you buy from a kablan. Right now, it's a mountaintop. It's a dugout foundation. There's nothing there, right? So there's a big risk. You don't know what the finished product is going to be, right? Also, and more importantly, there's a huge imbalance of power when you buy on paper, right? When I buy from you, for example, I'm a guy, you're a guy, we both have a house. We're kind of on. It's almost a level playing field. When you're buying from a huge kablan, they have a lot of power, a lot of money. You know what I mean? There's not so many regulations that are there are regulations, but not enough to protect you against this huge imbalanced equation, right? So that's the background, right? But besides that, the transaction itself is different, right? As opposed to there are regulations that exist to protect the consumer. So there's bank guarantees, there's different ways that the consumer can be protected. It's a totally different structure. Whereas when I buy when two individuals are in a transaction together, there's no laws, I mean, there are laws, but there's no structure, there's no regulations kind of controlling or shaping the way this transaction is. It's all the lawyers. The lawyers build it from start to end. Where does the money go? Who holds it? You know what I mean? Nobody has anything to say except the people that are involved. So it's very, very different. It's different. It's also important to realize the time frames is much different. If your house is built, I'm going to buy it from you. In a few months, I can have the keys probably. Kablan, it could be a year, 2 years, 5 years. You know what I
Cheers.
mean? So it's a long-term relationship with this big corporation. You know what I mean? So it's a totally different. The game is totally different.
So what I mean, you hear the joke often that Israel is really good at building construction sites and less good at building houses. What is protecting the individual who's buying on paper from having the process delayed indefinitely? What kind of recourse can be built in there in that process?
So there's legal protections, right? That in the form usually the most common is a bank guarantee, right? So meaning if I'm buying again, if we look at the background, which is kind of the umbrella of this whole thing, if I'm buying a house from you, I see the house exists. The risk is there's a less risk because I'm buying a product that exists already. When you're buying from a kablan, you're buying something that doesn't. You hope you're buying the commitment of the kablan to build something for you, right? And what if he doesn't do it? Right? That's the big risk here. So to counter that, to kind of soften that, the law says that your money should be guaranteed. Usually, it's by a bank, right? So your money goes into Bank Mizrahi, Bank Leumi, Bank Hapoalim, the big Israeli banks usually. They
Okay.
hold on to the money and they give it to the Kabbalah. They release it to the Kabbalah based on their financing agreement, which basically requires the Kabbalah to prove that he's building. And once he's building, then they're going to give him the money for that, right? So it kind of ensures that your money is going into the walls and the windows and the floors, as opposed to buy a new, a new Mercedes for the general manager of this corporation, right? So that's really the main protection is the bank guarantee, which is
Okay.
very significant, right? That being said, the banks don't love to guarantee your money, and they don't love to redeem the guarantee, right? So you can't just say, if you're buying, and all of a sudden the Kabbalah is 2 months late, 3 months late, 4 months late, the bank is not going to run and give you your cash and let you go, and so you can go on to the next project. No, usually it has to be a real issue. You know what I'm saying? Like that the Kabbalah is totally bankrupt. It's clear that he's not going to provide. Only then the bank steps in. So it's limited. It's not 100%. You know what I mean? It doesn't answer on all the
Right.
problems. You mentioned delays. Delays extremely common, right? So the law says that he has to give you after 60 days. There's a statutory penalty, 1.5
Okay.
times the rent, then it goes to 1.25. But again, it's running after the Kabbalah to collect is a different story. So there's no foolproof way, but the laws are there and they're good and they're helpful, but there's also work to be done behind that.
Right. So, putting aside whether prices are going up and down, which none of us can predict, if you're watching this and you're thinking about making Aliyah, you are in the process of making Aliyah already, does it make sense more to buy before Aliyah after you arrive? Let's say you're coming here on a pilot trip, you find the place that you want. Is there an advantage to buying before you actually make Aliyah or not?
Well, in your question, the question about prices going up is a financial question, right?
Of course.
Now, if we putting that right, so putting that
Put that
aside,
aside.
I'm saying
Yeah.
that's a big question because
That's a big one.
right.
Yes.
But I
Of
mean,
course.
I'll jump in there for a second because if prices keep going up 8, 10, 13% a year like they have been, so just looking at that, it makes sense to buy as early as possible. That's, from a financial point of view. That's not my place, and nobody knows if it's going to fall, so I'm not going to get into that. But that's just from a financial point of view. There's what to be said for that, all right?
Of course.
From a
Yeah.
legal perspective and from a practical perspective, there's very little difference, right? Meaning I have plenty of clients who buy before they make Aliyah, right? Or before they saw the place, and it can be done. It can be structured. It's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more expensive because you have to sometimes. I'm sure we'll get into this. You have to open up trust accounts often. There's to bring money from abroad as opposed to if you're here, you can kind of do a lot of legwork on your own. So you have to pay representatives to do a lot of the work for you. But in general, it's really there's very little difference, right? Meaning, all the difference in Israel is residency, where you live. Do you live outside? Do you live inside? In terms of taxes, in terms of process, right? But citizenship, whether you make Aliyah or not make Aliyah, right? Whether you're already an Israeli citizen or not, there's
Not a big
very
deal.
little difference in the process.
Perfect. Got
Yeah,
it.
there are some, but it's marginal and not a very big consideration.
Big consideration. Got it. So let's say you get to the point, you're ready, you found the place that you want to buy. What's the process of an offer? What does an offer look like? How is an offer different in Israel versus what somebody might be familiar with in the US?
Right. So offers in Israel are different. There's not a lot of substance to an offer in Israel, right? An offer in Israel is really meaning there's no money down. There's usually nothing in writing. There shouldn't. I mean, we might get into that, but there's ideally
Yeah.
there shouldn't be anything in writing, right? So it's a handshake. Two people sitting at a dining room table of the place you saw, for example, and discussing prices, and that's all it is. All it is really is kind of it's starting the process is when the lawyers jump in and start negotiating. Right? It's not a very significant legal milestone in the process. Right? It doesn't bind
It's
anybody.
basically
The
a
only I
handshake.
shouldn't say that. It's a handshake. It's a handshake. But once the lawyers get involved and the actual process, the wheels start turning, then the concept of good faith requires both parties to stick to it unless there's a good reason to back out, right? So meaning the offer does start that process, meaning it's kind of a quasi commitment to go through this process in a good faith manner, in a
Good
way
faith
that's
manner, right?
fair and clean and not to yeah. So meaning once you give an offer as a buyer, the seller really shouldn't be entertaining offers from third parties, from new buyers. Really, they should be taking down the notice, right? And they should be, entertaining your offer and just staying with you. It's kind of like an engagement before marriage. That's what it is, right? Engagements can be broken off, you know what I mean? But it's kind of just a starting point. It's not a irreversible commitment.
Okay. And continue with that. Should somebody sign a Zichron Dvarim, a MOU, if the buyer, if the seller asks specifically, okay, you made me an offer, now sign this document. Is that something somebody should do?
Yeah, so we should probably give some background to whoever's listening. A Zichron Dvarim, or an MOU in English, a memo of understanding, is basically a mini contract, right? That often the sellers will push you to. You're sitting and you handshake. They say, listen, if you want me to take it down, you don't want me to entertain other offers, I want you to sign that you're basically a small piece of paper saying on a napkin or an envelope saying, I'm going to buy this property for this amount. These are the dates, more or less, a couple of things here and there. So it's a contract, right? It's important to understand. This used to be very common in Israel. It used to be very, very common. You see a lot of old court cases. There were a ton of them, which these got to the courts, and for I'll explain why. So as a contract, it's important to understand when the seller is sitting there, he's saying, "You sign this, or I have 10 other buyers behind you." You're signing a contract, right? And signing a binding contract, but it's a bad contract. It's a contract, but a bad contract. A lot of the protections aren't in there. There's a lot of ambiguities. You know what I mean? There's a lot of terms which are not discussed. That's why instead of an 8-page contract, we're talking about a half a page contract. You can see there's a lot missing in there, right? So and it triggers tax obligations. So it's nowadays the advice is not to do it, not to give into the pressure. And it's uncommon enough now. I'm sorry, it's commonplace not to do it. It's commonplace enough not to do it that a buyer can feel confident telling a seller, "I've been advised not to sign anything right now until my lawyers review, and then move forward." So it's very unadvisable. I've had situations where people came to me with the Zichron Dvarim they signed, and that led to a year and a half of legal battles because they committed and there was compensation and penalties, but they didn't know. Their lawyers didn't check out. There were building violations. There's a lot that has to be done before a binding contract. So Zichron Dvarim is not a good idea in general. Now
Okay.
that being
Got it.
said, I'll add that
Yeah.
if it's just their dream house and there's literally a line of people out the door that are going to sign after him if he doesn't sign this piece of paper, and it's an important thing, even and the buyer wants to seal this deal, call a lawyer. There's ways to do it that you could there's phraseology to put in the Zichron Dvarim in MOU to make it non-binding, basically to neutralize it as a binding document, which takes out a lot of the power and a lot of the tax obligations, etc. And if that makes the seller happy, just have a list of basically a list of understandings as opposed to a list as opposed to a binding document, then that can be done. But again, even that not generally not.
Not got it. So let's say we've advanced, we get past the offer stage, and the buyer and the seller call up their lawyers and they ask, can you please begin negotiations, contract negotiations. Presumably they've agreed on the sale price. They've agreed on probably the biggest hot ticket item. What now are some of the things the lawyers are working on?
The lawyers do a few things. First of all, the first thing the lawyers are going to do, and mostly the buyer's lawyer, right, is going to be doing the due diligence, checking how clean everything is, right? Is the guy that you shook hands with really does he really own the property? Are there weird court orders? Are there weird liens that have to be structured into the contract? Right? Talking about taxes, and basically the lawyers are going to be checking how this transaction is going to look like, how safe is it, what the risks are, and that's just research, right? After that, it's also negotiating the contract, and based on the findings of what this property looks like, what the status of the seller is, what the buyer's situation is, to structure all that into the contract. Is the buyer taking a mortgage? Does that have to be discussed in the contract, right? There's a lot of different. Number one, there's principles to add to a contract to make sure that they're there, and there's the wording of those principles to make sure that everybody understands them, and if God forbid it gets to the courts will hopefully understand them the way you understand it, right? So that's what it is. Making sure the deal reflects the situation. For example, just to give you a couple examples, sometimes I get contracts and they're meaning in general, what the process in Israel is that the seller's lawyer drafts the first draft and the buyer's lawyer modifies it, right? So if I'm representing a buyer, I'll get a contract from the seller, but there's a lot of things missing, right? Let's say, there's penalties if the buyer makes a late payment. Fine, that's reasonable, but without a grace period sometimes, right? So usually it's common to add, as a one of many many examples I can give you. So add a few days, 5 days, 7 days to get things together, which is very very common as well, right? Just as an example. Or if there's no mortgage, right? But when you get a mortgage as a buyer, you need the cooperation of the seller. The seller has to open the house for the appraiser. The seller has to sign documents committing to the bank certain things. So if that's not in the contract, and then you want a mortgage, and the seller says, "Well, I don't have to sign any documents for the bank." So that's another example. There's a lot of things that have to be in there to protect. But I'm even kind of jumping to smaller resolution. The bigger picture here is protecting the buyer's money, right? The buyer is putting a lot of money, millions. There's not many properties that are under the million mark in Israel. We're talking about many, many millions, right? Exactly. And usually over $1 million even. That depending on where and what, but you want to make sure that your money's protected. So the first money that's going, the first payment that's being sent to the seller, the one of the major responsibilities of a lawyer is to make sure that money's protected. So that money should be held in escrow until a security is registered, protecting the buyer's rights, etc. So and kind of notifying third parties that there's a deal here, right? So that's some of the many things that the lawyer is going to be doing when reviewing the contract and negotiating.
Okay, so touch a little bit. I think you already did kind of talk about this a little bit, but on some of the things you're going to be having the buyer do while you're working on negotiations, some of the things that the buyer's going to have to be doing. Obviously, if there's a mortgage involved, they're going to need to be working with the bank. A shamai, an appraiser might be involved from either personal or for the bank. Inspection on their own, is that something that somebody should do, buying a third party property, buying a property from the secondary market?
Yeah, I'll explain because there's often a difference of how these deals are done in the U.S. or in almost all other Western countries and Israel. Let's assume for a second Israel is a Western country, right?
Yeah.
So the way it's done, so the mortgage approval you mentioned is very important because as opposed to other places where you can have some deals which are contingent on the buyer getting mortgage approval, right? There's some kind of exit clause. If the buyer doesn't get financing, the buyer can, in some places, in some situations, not in Israel, can terminate the contract. Here, it doesn't exist in Israel, right? So in Israel, when you sign a contract, you have to know that you have the means to finance this transaction,
Right.
right? So part of the process is getting an initial approval from the bank. Initial approval meaning here's what I'm.
Initial approval would be enough. Initial approval would be enough at this stage. You wouldn't need a final guarantee from the bank, or meaning what stage does that come in?
You're right. You're not going to get a final guarantee from the bank because you get an initial approval, and that's subject to the bank's appraisal, subject to later on some looking at your finances a little bit more closely. But an initial, and this is kind of more of a question for a mortgage broker, the exact process.
Yeah.
But in general, the bank looks at your general, who are you, what's your family status, what's your basic income, what kind of property you're buying, and they'll give you an initial approval to say, listen, if you buy this, we're comfortable enough with you that we're gonna commit to giving you this loan, right? But again, it's subject to later on getting appraised, which kind of goes to your next question. What about an appraisal, right? An appraisal is objectively a great idea. You want to know one of the things on the checklist when you're in the negotiating stage before signing, after handshake before signing, is to get an appraisal usually. Because what is the appraisal? The appraisal will check a few things. Number one, if there's any building violations, right? A lawyer, with all due respect, with contracts and words on papers, a lawyer doesn't know how to see the property and compare it to the plans and see if they added a room, see if I don't know, they split the unit, they went into the hallway and they stole some other area, things like that. A lot of shtick that happens in Israel. So an appraiser can do that. Appraiser will tell you whether or not there's building violations. That's just in general good for the buyer to know because he wants to know later on if the city's going to come and tell him to demolish something. So you want to know the product you're buying. Like if you buy a car, you're buying a used car. You want a mechanic to look under the hood and make sure that everything's safe and okay. So that's one part of an appraisal. Number two is the valuation for the bank, right? You could get an appraisal even before signing that will give you the certainty of how much the bank is going to value this property at, right? Why is that important? Because when a bank gives you an approval, let's say somebody's getting a
Yeah.
60% mortgage, that's what he applies for in the bank, and the bank approves your finances are okay. We think you're a solid borrower. 60%. That approval is 60% of the contract price. Let's just say 3 million shekel, or 60% of the appraised value, the lower of the two. So if he's closing at 3 million shekel, right, and then later on after signing he doesn't get an appraisal beforehand. So I'll wait till afterward. We'll see. It's cheaper. The appraisal afterward is cheaper. It's semi-regulated. So I'm going to do the appraisal afterward, and the appraisal comes back at 2.8, not at 3. So now he's got he's got this 200,000 shekel difference. He's not going to get 60% financing on that bit. So he has to, so the buyer has to know that that shortfall has to be financed from his own, from his or her own, sources. So that's another reason to do it. The reason people don't do it often, not often, a lot of times people don't want to do an appraisal before, is because it is more expensive before. It takes time, not so much time, a week. You know what I mean? Not a huge commitment of time, but it's a little bit more expensive. And it's another thing to do. So so sometimes people don't do it, but it's very, very advisable. Right? Inspection as well.
Got
You
it.
mentioned that as well. In Israel,
Yeah.
all secondhand places that you buy are as is. You're buying as is. You know what I mean? It's not subject to an inspection later on and subject to an engineer coming and seeing that the water's working, the plumbing. What you see is what you get, right? And even what you don't see is what you get, generally. So an inspector that's critical. If you're buying a secondhand property, that an inspector comes, he checks that there's moisture in the walls, if the electricity is working, you know what I mean? If there's things not up to standard. Those are the big things which are on the checklist. When we're dealing with the Anglo community, another big part of it is bringing money over, right? Bringing money from outside of Israel.
From the States. Right.
So you're right. You need the down payment, and the down payment is brought with you in the form of a check, usually to the signing.
Signing. Right. That's what I was going to ask you next. Perfect.
Right. Exactly. So now bringing money from anybody who has experience bringing money from outside of Israel into Israel, it's a way bigger hassle than you think it's going to be. You have to convince the banks think you're a criminal until you're a money launderer until you prove otherwise. So that's another big part of how to bring the money over, right? And that's even a separate maybe discussion. There's different ways, different
Yeah. Do you want
methods,
to
and how to do it. But
do
that's
you
kind
want
of
to touch on that a bit because that's I think that's very. I mean, I'll tell you on my blog one of the most important. The most shared post by far is people looking to save money on different currency transfers. That's an issue Olim really are focused on in a big way. But when it comes to buying a home, the focus is not only saving money, it's making sure you don't lose the deal and you have the money where you need to have it at the right time. So you want to touch on it in terms of your experience, some of the different ways to make sure the money gets here. Are trust accounts necessary? Can trust accounts help you in some way in this topic? How would you talk about that?
I'll touch on it, but I'll start. I mean, you mentioned having the money in the right place at the right time. It's critical because number one, you could lose a deal because if everything's ready, the contract is negotiated, inspections have been done, everybody's waiting to schedule, but there's no money. So that can often, the seller will get antsy and the seller will lose his confidence in the buyer often. I'm saying his, I'm obviously, just referring to everybody, any seller or buyer. The seller will lose confidence and might terminate the deal and find other buyers because, this we're ready to go, but these buyers are not coming through. So number one, you can lose the deal. Number two, more importantly, and this is in my experience lately happening more and more, after signing, if let's just say there's one payment now, whatever, 20% at signing, and then another 20% in 2 months, for example, and that second 20% payment is also coming from abroad. And if that payment is going to be made late, there's going to be penalties. There's going to be eventually it can become a very severe breach of contract, which can even which can be much more severe after signing than before. So it's very important to have a plan ahead of time how this money is going to come over for those reasons. I mean, imperative. I've seen lately more and more deals that are reaching points of very, very high contention because money is not being transferred in time from outside of Israel. Extremely important. So the ways to do there's I guess three ways to do that. Number one is having a bank account. The buyer should have a bank account in his or her name in Israel, ideally ahead of time. Meaning, if somebody's coming for Pesach, for example, they're planning on buying in the summer. Very important while they're here to go and with the guidance from their lawyer, from their mortgage broker, which we'll talk about, I hope, to go and open up a bank account. That's the most ideal way. To have your own personal bank account in your name in an Israeli bank. They know you. There's an address. There's a place in which to that can save a tremendous amount of time and energy and even money later on. Right? That's ideal. If somebody's not here and there's COVID and they can't get here and they're not planning on coming here and they can't open up they're not going to be here to open up their own bank account. So there's two other methods to do it. One is this. There's the safer one and the more, I guess, the easier, the more streamlined, easier way, right? The safer method is to have your attorney open a trust account in your name. right? Which is also he or her, the attorney opens up a trust account. The buyer is the sole beneficiary. It's a specific trust account for this purpose, for the purpose of this transaction. And then the buyer can send money from his or her account in California, New York, Toronto, London into this Israeli bank account, which is managed by the attorney. And that's great. It's great because it's bank to bank. It doesn't make any stopovers, and I'll explain the alternative in a minute. But it's from your account to your trust account, clean. The disadvantages of it are it's a big hassle to open up a trust account for it. Lawyers are going to charge, the bank fees are going to be high, right? It's also not going to be pleasant, but it's a very safe and tried and true way to do it. There's the other method is by using one of the foreign currency exchange companies. There's a number of them in Israel. Yeah, I'm not going to mention names. There's a good handful of them, but they provide that as a service. What you do is you send your money to them from abroad. They'll convert it. They'll be in touch with you. They'll negotiate a good rate for you, even in terms of the conversion. They'll be able to they'll give you a service of converting it at a beneficial time for you, etc. The the risk in that is that it goes through this company's corporate account, right?
Right.
So you have to be comfortable putting your money in the hands of this company for a small period of time. But they cut through the red tape. They get good fees, good service. So those are the methods that in general people use to bring money abroad, to bring
And
money
like you
from
mentioned,
abroad to Israel.
they will also issue a check that you could bring to signing, a bank check. Some of these services will offer that service. Yeah.
Most of them will do that. They'll do whatever you want with your money. They'll issue a check. They'll send it. They'll pay your taxes for you. They'll pay your attorney for you. They'll pay the broker. They'll distribute the funds however you want. It's a good service, and yeah, they'll do it for you. But it's important to I tell my clients this. It's important to realize the risk in doing so, and if somebody's going to be using one of these companies, which again they offer good service, I'm not discouraging the use, but to realize that you shouldn't be leaving a huge amount of money in somebody else's hands for a long period of time. You know what I mean? So as soon as you can use the money and do with it what you need to do with it, that's minimizes the risk.
Okay. So just in summary of I guess the signing the contract stage, what does a typical payment structure look like? A payment schedule? Not exact percentages. I understand they're going to be different in each case, but a basic. When should somebody expect to be paying out the different percentages of the final purchase price?
Okay, so look, it used to be you see old contracts, and when I deal with lawyers who are from a previous generation, so to speak, they used to be very common, especially in Jerusalem, which has its own legal culture in terms of real estate. So it used to be very common to see a third, a third, a third, right? A third at signing, a third somewhere in the middle. Why? No real reason. It's kind of arbitrary, just to show that you're keeping up with this transaction, you're invested, and then a third at completion when you get the keys. That is kind of that's kind of gone extinct, but it's common. You still see it in older contracts. You see it with people that are used to a certain way of doing things. Nowadays, things are very dynamic, right? The buyers might want to get a mortgage at a certain time. They might not have funds available for a certain time. The seller might have a high mortgage, which has to be satisfied within the framework of the transaction earlier and not later. Or the seller might need a larger amount of money to put toward his or her new property that they're buying in a back-to-back situation, right? There's a lot of different constraints and considerations which are taken into account, and a payment schedule is structured based on that.
So it's part of
However,
the negotiation. Yeah. Yeah.
it's part of negotiation. It's usually not part of the legal negotiations, although the lawyers find themselves involved in it, maybe sometimes more than they should be. Usually, this is something that should be negotiated between the buyer and seller, the parties themselves, because it's commercial, it's not legal. However, there are legal issues which come in and influence that, right? Meaning sometimes part of it is let's say like this: there has to be a minimum of 10% at signing. Why 10%? Because that's the standard agreed penalty. Meaning, if the buyer puts 10% at signing and then he or she walks away from the deal, there's no deal. The 10% is the seller's penalty that the seller is allowed to keep for himself as a penalty for this term exactly. So for that reason, there's at least 10% at signing, no questions asked. Afterward, sometimes you have to pay the seller's taxes. There's it's kind of complex, but sometimes there's a situation in which the buyer has to pay the seller's taxes earlier on. So how much is that tax exposure? So that has to be calculated, and that will also influence that's a legal issue, but that's going to influence the commercial payment structure. How much is the mortgage? Like I mentioned, if the seller has a mortgage of 1.5 million shekel, which has to be cleared earlier on in the process, usually before the buyer's mortgage bank is going to step in. So that also is going to have a very, very heavy impact on the payment schedule. So when the buyer and seller are shaking hands, they often don't yet have the tools to know what the payment schedule is going to be. That's going to have to be discussed later on. But 10% at the beginning, at the end, there needs to be enough to cover the seller's different taxes and exposure to protect the buyer. But beyond that, everything in the middle is up for negotiation. Yeah.
Okay.
Based on whatever the situation is.
Can you give a brief summary of purchase taxes? What it looks like? When does the clock start ticking in terms of when you owe the purchase tax, and how does that work?
Okay, purchase tax. We can have a few discussions on purchase tax, and not to mention even capital gains tax when you sell. These are all extremely broad, very, very broad, and in Israel, very complicated. But I'll try to give you a succinct overview.
Yeah,
In
great.
general, so there's different rates. First, let's talk about the rates. When there's one the best rate, I mean best, one of the very, very good tax rates when you buy a home is the single home rate for an Israeli resident. So meaning somebody who lives in Israel and they don't have any other properties, they're buying their not their first home, because you can buy 10 homes with this same rate. It's your only home. You buy, sell, right? So only home residential rate, and that starts at 0% up to around 1.8, and then it jumps 3.5, 5, 8, 10. It gets high, but it's on a sliding scale. So the higher the value of the property, or the more you're buying the property for, the higher the rate's going to be. But it starts at 0, so it's a beneficial rate. It's a good rate. Then that's the rate we all try to get. Then there's the second home rate, right? Meaning an Israeli resident who's buying a second property, or even the first home for a non-Israeli resident. So if somebody is
Okay.
not planning on making Aliyah, right, and they live in California, they live in Cleveland, and they're buying a property, so they're going to have to pay the higher rate, which is 8%. And at a certain point, it even jumps to 10%. So it's a dramatic difference. Very, very high rate. Now, it should be said, what's very, very important to point out when you talk about these rates is that even if somebody is not an Israeli resident, if they're planning on moving to Israel within 2 years, legally they're considered an Israeli resident, even if they're signing now, right? So whenever somebody asks me how much my taxes are going to be, I'm thinking about buying, and they're calling me from somewhere else in the world, not Israel. So my first question is, are you planning on making Aliyah? Or I should correct that, not making Aliyah. Are you planning on moving to Israel, right? Because the single home Israeli resident rate is given to residents, not citizens. So meaning you don't have to make Aliyah if you live in Israel. Somebody can live in Israel for 50 years and not become a citizen, and they're still entitled to this rate, right? So that's important. People ask me, I have citizenship, I don't have citizenship, I'm going to make Aliyah. Really, it doesn't really make a difference. It's, do you live in Israel? Do you not live in Israel, right? So if somebody's buying before they make Aliyah, like you mentioned, but they're planning on moving to Israel within the next 2 years, they're really entitled to the lower rate, which is
Got it.
which is usually a difference of hundreds of thousands, literally, meaning hundreds of thousands of shekels. If we're talking about the average property price, right? Now the big question is though, do they have to pay the higher rate and then get it back, or can they somehow pay the lower rate even though they're not Israeli residents yet? Right? And that'll depend on there's different parts of the country. Believe it or not, there's not a uniform policy on this. Different parts of the country, welcome to Israel. So there's
Yeah.
different tax offices. There's the north, there's the south, there's Tel Aviv, there's Jerusalem, there's Rehovot, there's Beersheba. There's all different tax offices, and they have different policies. So when people ask me this question, I say, where are you buying, and when are you moving to Israel? And that's going to be the difference of whether they're going to have to pay upfront that 8% and get it back with interest later on, or they're going to be able to get by paying the lower rate. And people do get the tax back. It just takes a while, and they get it back with interest. So if they make Aliyah afterward, if they move to Israel, so that's important to know. Now there's another one, and this is very commonly asked. I assume it's asked in your forums as well, because I get asked this question at least once a week.
Okay.
there's a benefit for Olim. Olim I read that there's a purchase tax benefit for Olim, right?
Right.
That is true, but it's very rarely used, right? Meaning there is a separate rate for Olim, a very good rate. It's 0.5% on the whole amount. So it's at some point it's better than the regular single home Israeli
Right.
resident rate, right? Once you get beyond 5.5 million shekel around, that's when it becomes more beneficial. But it's really not a very useful beneficial rate because of that. It's for if you're buying for underneath 5.5 million shekel, it ends up usually around 10,000 shekel more in taxes
Got it.
to employ this rate, right? So you're going to be trying to get the single home residence rate. That being said, there are some very rare situations where it is a very good rate, but it's not. But again, it's they're few and far between. If it's a couple, let's just say it's a couple buying, and one of them have a property in Israel already, right? And it's within 7 years, by the way, of making aliyah. You make aliyah, you have 7 years to use it. And let's say there's a couple, and one of them have their own property, and the other one they made aliyah 5 years ago, for example, and they're buying their first house, and they're going to be living in it, right? It's one of the conditions. So they're buying the house to live in it. One of them has an investment from earlier on. So that's a perfect place to use this rate because since they're married, they're both not entitled to the single home resident because by virtue of the fact that one of the couple already owns a property. But the Oleh
Interesting.
rate
Yeah.
is good for that. Meaning, if one of the couple, of the married couple, is entitled to the benefit, then the other one is as well, even though that spouse already owns a property. So there's a few situations in which it's beneficial and useful, but it's usually it's not oftenly used. So that's the answer about that,
And
right?
it's great. It's a great summary. I understand it's a pretty complex issue. But when's the tax due? Meaning when should I expect to have to pay whatever my tax rate is, whatever that ends up being? When should I expect to have to pay this?
That's also a question that I'm asked, and the answer always surprises people. The tax is due usually by default 60 days after signing.
Signing.
So you sign today, within 6 days you have to pay. Even though you're not going to be receiving possession, it could be for another 6 months, right? So buyers often ask me, wait a second, why should I be paying taxes now? I don't even know if the deal is going to go through. The deal's not done. And the answer is Kaka. That's the rule. The taxes are due within 2 months of paying, right? Of signing. However, you could defer the tax. You can defer the payment if that's difficult. Sometimes people need a little more time to liquidate assets to come up with money for that. So you could push off payment until the point in which you pay 50% to the seller, 50% of the consideration for the house, right? You're buying for 5 million and you've only paid 2 million now, not 2.5, and you're only going to pay 2.5 in another, I don't know, a year from now, or 6 months from now. So you could push off payment of the tax until the 6 month mark when you pay 2.5 million, 50% of what you're going to owe to the seller. But there's going to be some interest accrued from the 60-day mark until when you actually pay the tax. So there's a little price. There's not a very dramatic price, but there's a
Okay.
price to
There's some.
deferring the payment. But it could be deferred. But in general, 60 days. And if the deal falls through, to answer the question that everybody asked me, well, what if the deal falls through? Which, by the way, answer number one is that it's very rare for a deal to fall through in Israel because
At that
there's
stage,
very
yeah.
harsh penalties for a deal falling through. Yeah. It's once a signing is really, it's very rare for that to happen. But if it does, then the termination of the deal is reported to the tax authorities. They'll give it back to you with interest. It might take a few months of you chasing them, but they'll give it back to you eventually
Of
with
course.
interest, and that's how it works. But 60 days from signing is the that's the rule of
Is the
thumb.
number. Perfect. So if we could sum it up and kind of you know, the main question at the end everybody wants to know about is, okay, I've signed, I've got the payment structure in place. When does the property become mine? When is it? What is the process for registering the property? How do I get my name on that property?
That's certainly so. That is the finish line. The ultimate goal is to have the registration of the property in your name, your buyer's name, right? Now, there's two different in Israel, believe it or not, or if you've been in Israel for a while, believe it, that could take a long time. It could take a long time. A lot has to happen. The tax authority has to fully process the file and confirm that there's no taxes due, and they're okay with your assessment of the transaction, that you don't owe any other taxes. the city or the local regional council has to sign off and approve the deal. Hopefully, there's no building violations, which could put a spoke in the wheel. But the different documents that have to be produced. But often that can take a while. That can take certainly months, certainly, many months. So what you often have in Israel is a situation where the buyer pays full payment, receives legal possession, right? So legally the house is now belongs to the buyer because full consideration has been paid. The contract has been, fully satisfied. Everybody's done their part, but it's still registered in the seller's name. Could be for a few months. It could be, unfortunately, sometimes you have situations where it could be a year, right? Where the buyer has done renovations, the buyer is living there, the buyer is totally happy, but it's still not fully registered in his or her name, right? And that can take a while. But it's very, very important to know. And this is, and sometimes people can, when they hear that, they can,
Get worried.
get very unnerved. What
Yeah.
do you mean? I'm living in a house. I paid full money. I've invested, I've invested hundreds of thousands in renovations and et cetera. And all this, and it's not even in my name in the registry. So the answer is that there, from day one, before the first checkout gets to the pocket of the seller, there should be a protection, a note of caution, however you want to translate it. There's a legal instrument that's registered on the property which protects the contractual right of the buyer. So even though the title is still in the seller's name, there's a note underneath saying that this is the buyer, a contract's been signed, and that
The seller can't jump
buyer.
in and
So
try
that's what that
and try
often
and sell it
happens.
again, basically. Meaning that there is protection
Right, no,
against
for
that.
sure, exactly. The first
Yeah.
there's full protection against that. The right, so meaning any other buyer who's going to come, and if the sellers are going to try to sell, the Brooklyn Bridge to somebody else, so the next buyer is going to look on title and say, well, first of all, they're going to see somebody else is living in the house, right? But they're also going to see that on title, who is this buyer that bought. But there is the other implication of that is it does protect from future buyers because nobody's going to want to buy this property because this buyer is protected. However, if the seller, and this is something to be aware of, that this could theoretically happen in Israel, if between ownership, right, when the buyer receives the keys and legally it's his or her house, that's it, the buyers are living there, but it's not yet registered in their names. So if the seller gets sued, right, or he owes the sellers owe money in taxes, whatever, and the authorities chase, they're still going to see this property is registered in the seller's name, so they could register a lien. But and this is the very, very important thing, is that the protection that the buyer has puts the buyer in first in line,
Okay.
right, against any other creditors. So if somebody sues him, it's really not going to be worth anybody's time to register a lien on this house if the seller, because you as a buyer are
You've got it.
already first in line. So ultimately, what I mean, if that, since even though that's how it works, it's kind of convoluted. It's a long bureaucratic process.
The
Despite that, the
protections are
buyer is
there.
still protected.
Yeah. Got it.
The protected there, and that's
Awesome.
the lawyer's responsibility to make sure that it's there, to make sure that it's valid, that it fully protects, and there's different kind of properties which are registered different ways,
Right.
and that's really one of the lawyer's main responsibilities to make sure that happens the right way. Yeah.
Awesome. Mickey, this has been super informative. Thank you so much for your time. Can you tell the audience here a little bit more about where we can follow you, where we can learn more about your firm, about your services, and everything like that?
Well, I can be reached. I believe you can post a link to my website, which has
For sure.
phone numbers, emails, ways to find me. That's usually the best way. There's other ways, LinkedIn, Facebook, but the website is a very efficient way to reach me. And I'm certainly thankful for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer other questions if as they come up.
Awesome. Mickey, really appreciate your time. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day.
Take care.